Everyone loves an underdog story, but what happens when the underdog isn't just fighting against the odds? They're fighting against an entire system that says what they want to achieve is literally impossible. What happens when every expert, every authority figure, every piece of conventional wisdom stands united in declaring that a dream is nothing more than a fantasy? This is the story of Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman who refused to accept impossible as an answer. While the world's leading scientists were looking up at the stars and deep into ocean trenches for signs of life beyond Earth, Sarah was looking somewhere else entirely, somewhere so obvious that everyone had dismissed it without a second thought. They said she was wasting her time. They said she was chasing shadows. They said her research was pseudoscience and her methods were flawed. The scientific community didn't just ignore her, they actively worked to discredit her. But Sarah had something they didn't, the courage to look where no one else was looking, and the persistence to keep searching even when the entire world told her to stop. What she found didn't just change science forever, it changed everything we thought we knew about life itself. This is the true story of how one woman's impossible discovery shocked the world and proved that sometimes the biggest breakthroughs happen when you have the courage to search in the places everyone else has already given up on. Dr. Sarah Chen never intended to revolutionize science. In fact, she never even intended to become a scientist at all. Growing up in a small town in Oregon, Sarah was the daughter of immigrants who ran a family restaurant. Her parents had simple dreams for their daughter: stability, security, and a steady paycheck. Science, with its uncertainty and years of education, seemed like an impractical choice. But Sarah was different from the beginning. While other children collected dolls or baseball cards, she collected rocks, leaves, and anything else she could find in nature. Her bedroom looked more like a natural history museum than a typical kid's room. Her parents worried she was obsessed with what they saw as useless hobbies. The first sign that Sarah saw the world differently came when she was 12 years old. The local newspaper ran a story about mysterious fish deaths in a nearby river. Environmental officials blamed pollution from a factory upstream, and everyone accepted this explanation. Everyone except Sarah. Instead of just reading the newspaper article like everyone else, Sarah decided to investigate for herself. She spent weeks collecting water samples, studying the dead fish, and documenting everything she found. What she discovered was surprising. The fish deaths weren't caused by pollution at all. They were caused by a natural phenomenon that occurred when certain algae bloomed under specific temperature conditions. When Sarah presented her findings to her middle school science teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez was amazed. Not only was Sarah correct, but her methods were more thorough than those used by the environmental officials. Mrs. Rodriguez encouraged Sarah to submit her research to the regional science fair. At the science fair, Sarah faced her first taste of scientific skepticism. The judges initially dismissed her project because it contradicted the official explanation from environmental experts. How could a 12-year-old know better than trained professionals? But when they looked at her evidence, they couldn't argue with her results. Sarah won first place, but more importantly, she learned that being right didn't always mean being believed. This experience taught Sarah two crucial lessons that would shape her entire career. First, official explanations aren't always correct. And second, sometimes you have to look beyond what everyone else is looking at to find the truth. High school brought new challenges for Sarah. Her family's financial situation made college seem impossible. Her parents pushed her toward practical careers like nursing or teaching, but Sarah's heart was set on research science. She worked nights and weekends at the family restaurant while maintaining perfect grades and conducting independent research projects. Sarah's high school biology teacher, Mr. Park, became her mentor and advocate. He recognized her exceptional talent and helped her apply for scholarships. But even with Mr. Park's support, Sarah faced constant pressure from her family to abandon her scientific dreams. The pressure intensified during her senior year when her father suffered a heart attack. With medical bills piling up and the restaurant struggling, Sarah's parents begged her to stay home and help run the family business. They couldn't understand why she wanted to pursue something as uncertain as scientific research when the family needed her help immediately. For months, Sarah wrestled with this decision. She loved her family and felt guilty about pursuing her own dreams while they struggled financially. But Mr. Park convinced her that giving up her potential would ultimately help no one. He helped her find a full scholarship to Oregon State University, along with a work-study program that would allow her to send money home to her family. At Oregon State, Sarah threw herself into her studies with an intensity that amazed her professors. While other students struggled with basic concepts, Sarah was already thinking beyond the textbook. She asked questions that her professors couldn't answer, and proposed research ideas that seemed to come from someone with years more experience. Michael Torres, head of the biology department, became Sarah's undergraduate advisor. He was impressed by her unconventional thinking, but worried about her tendency to challenge established scientific theories. During one memorable meeting, he told her, "Sarah, your enthusiasm is admirable, but science progresses through careful, incremental steps. You can't just throw out decades of established research because you have a different idea." But Sarah couldn't help questioning everything. In her microbiology class, she wondered why certain bacteria behave differently in laboratory conditions than they did in nature. In her ecology class, she questioned whether the standard methods for studying ecosystems were actually capturing the full picture. Her professors began to see her as brilliant but difficult. The turning point came during her junior year when Sarah was assigned to work on a research project studying soil microorganisms. The project was supposed to be straightforward: collect soil samples from different locations and identify the types of bacteria present. But as Sarah began her work, she noticed something that didn't make sense. The standard techniques for studying soil bacteria involved growing them in laboratory cultures under controlled conditions. But Sarah observed that many bacteria that appeared in the soil samples simply wouldn't grow in the lab cultures. When she mentioned this to her supervising graduate student, he dismissed her observations. "That's normal," he told her. "Not all bacteria can be cultured in a lab. We work with what we can grow." But this answer didn't satisfy Sarah. If they were only studying bacteria that could grow in artificial laboratory conditions, how could they claim to understand what was actually happening in natural soil? It seemed like trying to understand human behavior by only studying people in prison cells. Sarah decided to investigate further on her own time. She developed new techniques for studying bacteria directly in soil samples without trying to grow them in laboratory cultures first. What she found was shocking. The vast majority of bacteria in soil were completely unknown to science because no one had ever been able to study them using traditional laboratory methods. When Sarah presented her findings to Dr. Torres, he was skeptical. He suggested that Sarah was probably making technical errors in her new methods, but Sarah was certain of her results. She repeated her experiments dozens of times, refining her techniques and documenting everything meticulously. Each time she got the same results. The soil was teeming with bacterial life that science had never discovered because researchers were only looking in the wrong places. This discovery set the stage for everything that would follow in Sarah's career. She had learned to look beyond conventional methods and to question fundamental assumptions about how science should be conducted. She had also learned that even when you're right, convincing others of unconventional discoveries can be the hardest part of the scientific process. As Sarah prepared for graduate school, she knew she wanted to continue studying the hidden world of microorganisms that everyone else was missing. She had no idea that this passion would eventually lead her to a discovery that would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about life itself. Dr. Torres, despite his initial skepticism, wrote Sarah a strong recommendation letter for graduate school. In it, he noted her exceptional abilities but also warned about her tendency to challenge established methods. He wrote, "Sarah Chen is the most talented undergraduate researcher I have ever worked with. However, her reluctance to accept conventional wisdom may make her a challenging graduate student. She has the potential to make significant contributions to science, but only if she can learn to work within established scientific frameworks." This recommendation would prove to be both prophetic and ironic. Sarah's refusal to accept conventional wisdom would indeed make her a challenging graduate student, but it would also lead her to discoveries that would revolutionize those very scientific frameworks that Dr. Torres wanted her to accept. As Sarah packed her belongings and prepared to leave Oregon State University, she carried with her not just the knowledge she had gained from textbooks and lectures, but also the confidence that came from already making an original scientific discovery. She had learned that the most important discoveries often happen when you look in places where everyone else has already decided there's nothing to find. She had no way of knowing that this lesson would soon lead her to the most unlikely place of all, where she would find something that would change everything. Stanford University was everything Sarah had dreamed of and everything she had feared. The prestigious institution offered unlimited research opportunities and access to the world's leading scientists, but it also came with intense pressure and competition that made her undergraduate experience seem relaxed by comparison. Sarah's graduate advisor was Dr. Robert Hutchinson, one of the most respected microbiologists in the world. Dr. Hutchinson had spent 30 years studying extremophiles, microorganisms that lived in the most hostile environments on Earth. His laboratory was at the forefront of astrobiology research, searching for clues about how life might exist on other planets. From their first meeting, it was clear that Dr. Hutchinson and Sarah had very different approaches to science. Dr. Hutchinson believed in following established protocols and building incrementally on previous research. Sarah, true to her nature, immediately began questioning why they were limiting their search to extreme environments. "Dr. Hutchinson," she asked during one of their early meetings, "if we're trying to understand the limits of life, why do we only look in places that are obviously extreme? What if we're missing something important in environments that seem ordinary?" Hutchinson smiled patiently. "Sarah, we study extreme environments because that's where we find the most unusual forms of life. If there were anything extraordinary in ordinary environments, don't you think we would have found it by now?" This response frustrated Sarah, but she knew better than to argue with one of the world's leading experts on her first week of graduate school. Instead, she threw herself into the laboratory's ongoing projects, hoping to prove herself before suggesting alternative approaches. The Hutchinson lab was working on several high-profile projects. One team was studying bacteria that lived in boiling hot springs in Yellowstone National Park. Another group was analyzing microorganisms from the deepest parts of the ocean. A third team was investigating bacteria that could survive in highly acidic conditions that would kill most forms of life. Sarah was assigned to the Hot Springs Project, which meant spending several months each year in Yellowstone collecting samples and analyzing them back at Stanford. The work was fascinating, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important by focusing exclusively on these extreme conditions. During her first field trip to Yellowstone, Sarah made an observation that her colleagues dismissed as irrelevant. While collecting samples from the hot springs, she noticed that there were always ordinary-looking areas right next to the extreme environments they were studying. Most researchers ignored these transition zones because they weren't extreme enough to be interesting. But Sarah was curious about these boundary areas. What kinds of organisms lived in the spaces between extreme and normal conditions? During her free time, she began collecting samples from these transition zones and studying them with the same intensity that her colleagues applied to the extreme environments. What Sarah found in these overlooked areas was remarkable. The transition zones contained microorganisms that were completely different from both the extremophiles in the hot springs and the ordinary bacteria found in normal soil. These organisms seemed to have unique adaptations that allowed them to thrive in conditions that were neither extremely hot nor normal temperature. When Sarah presented her findings to the research team, they were politely interested but ultimately dismissive. Dr. Kurd put on the paper. Hutchinson explained that while her observations were noteworthy, they weren't relevant to the lab's main research goals. "We're funded to study extremophiles, Sarah," he told her. "These transition zone organisms you found are interesting, but they don't help us understand how life might exist on other planets where conditions are truly extreme." Sarah accepted this explanation, but privately she wondered if they were making a fundamental error in their approach. Why assume that life on other planets would only exist in extremely hostile conditions? What if alien life was hiding in places that seemed too ordinary to investigate? This question became an obsession for Sarah. She began reading everything she could find about astrobiology and the search for extraterrestrial life. The more she read, the more convinced she became that the scientific community was making a crucial mistake. Almost all research into potential alien life focused on extreme environments: the subsurface oceans of icy moons, the highly acidic clouds of Venus, the radiation-blasted surface of Mars. Scientists assumed that if life existed elsewhere in the universe, it would have to be as extreme as the conditions it lived in. But Sarah had a different idea. What if alien life was actually quite ordinary? What if it existed in conditions that were so normal, so unremarkable, that no one had thought to look there? The more Sarah thought about this possibility, the more excited she became. But she also knew that suggesting such an idea to her colleagues would be professional suicide. The entire field of astrobiology was built on the assumption that extraterrestrial life would be found in extreme environments. Challenging that assumption would be like challenging the foundation of the entire discipline. For months, Sarah kept her ideas to herself while continuing her assigned research on extremophiles. But the frustration of not being able to pursue her real interests began to affect her work. Dr. Hutchinson noticed that Sarah seemed distracted and called her into his office for a frank discussion. "Sarah, you're one of the most talented graduate students I've ever worked with," he told her. "But lately you seem disengaged from our research. Is there something bothering you?" Sarah hesitated. She knew that being honest about her doubts could damage her relationship with her advisor and potentially end her graduate career. But she also knew that she couldn't continue pretending to be enthusiastic about research she fundamentally disagreed with. "Dr. Hutchinson," she began carefully, "I've been thinking about our approach to astrobiology research, and I wonder if we might be overlooking something important." Hutchinson leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral. Go on. Sarah took a deep breath and explained her theory. She suggested that the search for extraterrestrial life might be focusing on the wrong environments. Instead of looking only in extreme conditions, she argued, scientists should also be investigating environments that seem too ordinary to be interesting. Dr. Hutchinson listened patiently, but Sarah could see skepticism growing in his eyes as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, he said finally, I appreciate your creativity, but you're essentially suggesting that the entire astrobiology community has been looking in the wrong places for decades. Don't you think that if there were life in ordinary environments that we haven't discovered, someone would have found it by now? But what if we haven't found it precisely because it's in ordinary environments? Sarah replied. What if we've been so focused on looking for the extraordinary that we've overlooked the extraordinary hiding in the ordinary? Dr. Hutchinson shook his head. Sarah, science doesn't work that way. We study extreme environments because that's where we find the most interesting forms of life. If you want to contribute to this field, you need to work within established frameworks, not try to reinvent everything from scratch. This conversation marked a turning point in Sarah's graduate career. She realized that she would never be able to pursue her real interests within the constraints of conventional astrobiology research. But she also knew that abandoning her ideas would mean giving up on what she believed could be the most important scientific discovery of her lifetime. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She would continue her assigned research on extremophiles to satisfy her graduate requirements, but she would also secretly pursue her own research on the side. She would look for life in the most ordinary, unremarkable places she could find. The first place Sarah decided to investigate was her own backyard. If extraterrestrial life could be hiding in ordinary environments, then perhaps there were forms of terrestrial life hiding in ordinary environments too. She began collecting samples from the most mundane locations she could think of: suburban lawns, city sidewalks, parking lots, and shopping mall landscaping. Her colleagues would have been shocked if they had known what Sarah was doing in her spare time. While they spent their weekends analyzing samples from exotic locations around the world, Sarah was crawling around suburban neighborhoods with collection equipment, looking for signs of life that everyone else considered too boring to study. The early results of Sarah's secret research were disappointing. The organisms she found in these ordinary environments were exactly what any microbiologist would expect: common bacteria and fungi that had been studied extensively for decades. There was nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary, nothing that suggested she was on the verge of a major discovery. But, Sarah persisted, she refined her collection methods, expanded her search areas, and developed new techniques for analyzing samples that might contain unknown forms of life. She was like a detective searching for clues that everyone else had overlooked, following leads that seemed to go nowhere. Months passed with no significant discoveries. Sarah's secret research was taking up more and more of her time, while her official graduate work began to suffer. Hutchinson expressed concern about her declining performance on the extremophile project, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to abandon her private investigation. The breakthrough came in the most unexpected place of all: a sample collected from the concrete steps outside the Stanford Library. Sarah had collected this sample almost as a joke, thinking that if there were undiscovered life forms hiding in ordinary environments, surely they wouldn't be found on a heavily traveled concrete staircase on one of the world's most prestigious university campuses. But when Sarah analyzed this sample using her newly developed techniques, she found something that made her question everything she thought she knew about life on Earth. The concrete steps contained microorganisms unlike anything that had ever been documented in scientific literature. These weren't just unknown species. They were unknown forms of life that operated according to biological principles that science didn't recognize. Sarah stared at her data for hours, checking and rechecking her results. She had found something impossible: complex, organized biological activity in one of the most unlikely places on Earth. And if she was right about what she was seeing, it meant that science had been fundamentally wrong about where life could exist and how it could function. The most shocking part was not just what she had found, but where she had found it. Everyone had been looking up at the stars and down into ocean depths for signs of extraordinary life, while it was hiding in plain sight on the steps of a library that thousands of people walked on every day. Sarah realized that she was facing the most important decision of her life. She could ignore her discovery and continue with her conventional graduate research, or she could pursue findings that would almost certainly destroy her academic career if she was wrong, but could revolutionize science if she was right. As she sat alone in the laboratory late that night, staring at data that challenged everything the scientific community believed about life itself, Sarah knew there was only one choice she could live with. She had to find out just how impossible her discovery really was. Sarah Chen had never felt more alone in her life. The data from the library steps sample sat on her computer like a ticking bomb, waiting to either vindicate her wildest theories or destroy her scientific credibility forever. She had discovered what appeared to be a completely unknown form of life in the most mundane location imaginable, but she had no idea how to prove it to a scientific community that would rather believe in aliens from distant galaxies than accept that they had overlooked something extraordinary right under their noses. For weeks after her initial discovery, Sarah lived in a state of constant anxiety. She repeated her analysis dozens of times, each test confirming what seemed impossible. The concrete steps outside Stanford's library harbored microorganisms that functioned according to biological principles that weren't supposed to exist. These organisms didn't just represent new species, they represented an entirely different approach to life itself. They seemed to exist in a state that was neither fully alive nor completely dormant, shifting between states of activity and inactivity in patterns that followed no known biological rhythms. They appeared to derive energy from sources that conventional biology said couldn't support life, and they organized themselves into structures that resembled nothing in any microbiology textbook. The most disturbing aspect of Sarah's discovery was how common these organisms appeared to be once she knew how to look for them. Using her new detection methods, she began finding similar life forms in concrete samples from locations all over the Stanford campus. Sidewalks, building foundations, parking garages, plaza surfaces. Everywhere she looked, she found evidence of this hidden biological world that science had never recognized. Sarah realized she was facing a dilemma that went far beyond her graduate research. If she was correct about what she had found, it meant that the scientific understanding of life on Earth was fundamentally incomplete. Billions of people walked over these life forms every day without knowing they existed. Scientists had been searching for extraterrestrial life in the most remote corners of the universe, while ignoring an alien world that existed beneath their feet in every city on the planet. But Sarah also knew that making such an extraordinary claim would require extraordinary evidence, and she was just one graduate student working alone, in secret. She needed help, but approaching anyone in the scientific community seemed impossible. Who would believe that she had discovered an entirely new domain of life in suburban concrete? The isolation began affecting every aspect of Sarah's life. She became increasingly secretive and paranoid, afraid that someone would discover her unauthorized research before she could properly document her findings. She stopped socializing with other graduate students and avoided discussions about research during lab meetings. Dr. Peradil. Hutchinson noticed her strange behavior and expressed concern, but Sarah deflected his questions with vague explanations about personal stress. Sarah's secret investigation expanded beyond the Stanford campus as she collected samples from urban environments throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. She developed cover stories about studying pollution or urban ecology to explain why she was collecting concrete samples from sidewalks and buildings. The more locations she sampled, the more convinced she became that these hidden life forms were ubiquitous in human-made environments. The organisms seemed to thrive specifically in the boundary zones between natural and artificial materials. They were most abundant in concrete that was in contact with soil, in asphalt that bordered vegetation, and in building foundations that met natural ground. It was as if they represented a bridge between the natural world that science understood and the artificial world that humans had created. After months of secret research, Sarah realized she needed to take a calculated risk. She couldn't continue working in complete isolation forever, and she needed access to more sophisticated equipment to fully characterize her discoveries. She decided to approach Dr. Primer, Jennifer Walsh, a young professor in the environmental science department who had a reputation for being open to unconventional research. Dr. Reed. Walsh was intrigued when Sarah requested a private meeting to discuss some unusual findings from her independent research. Sarah had prepared extensively for this conversation, anticipating skepticism and preparing responses to every possible objection. She brought printed data, microscope images, and detailed analysis charts, presenting her case as methodically as a lawyer arguing before a jury. Dr. Walsh listened in stunned silence as Sarah explained her discovery. The evidence was overwhelming, but the implications were so radical that Dr. Atria Walsh initially assumed there must be a fundamental error in Sarah's methodology. However, as she examined the data more closely, she couldn't identify any obvious flaws in Sarah's approach. Sarah, Dr. Walsh said finally, if you're right about this, it changes everything. But you realize how impossible this sounds, don't you? You're claiming that science has missed an entire category of life that exists everywhere in urban environments. I know how it sounds, Sarah replied. But I've checked and rechecked my methods hundreds of times. I've collected samples from dozens of locations. The evidence is consistent everywhere I look. Dr. Walsh studied the microscope images that showed the strange organizational patterns of the concrete-dwelling organisms. These structures don't match anything I've seen before. What makes you think they're alive? Sarah had anticipated this question. They respond to stimuli, they reproduce, they adapt to changing conditions, and they maintain organized structures over time. They meet every scientific definition of life, but they do it in ways that don't fit our current understanding of how life works. Dr. Walsh was quiet for a long time, examining Sarah's data and considering the implications. Finally, she looked up with an expression that mixed excitement and terror. Sarah, if you're right about this, it's the biggest scientific discovery in decades. But if you're wrong, it could end both of our careers. Are you absolutely certain about your findings? I'm certain about what I've observed, Sarah replied. I'm not certain about what it means, and I'm definitely not certain about how the scientific community will react when they find out. Dr. Walsh made a decision that would change both of their lives. I want to help you with this research, but we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. We need independent verification of your findings before we can even think about publishing or presenting this work. Over the following months, Dr. Walsh and Sarah worked together in secret to expand and verify the research. Dr. Walsh had access to equipment and facilities that Sarah couldn't use as a graduate student, allowing them to conduct more sophisticated analyses of the concrete-dwelling organisms. Every test confirmed Sarah's initial findings while revealing new complexities that made the discovery even more extraordinary. The organisms appeared to have a distributed intelligence that allowed them to coordinate activities across large areas of concrete surfaces. They seemed to communicate through chemical signals and could collectively respond to changes in their environment. Most remarkably, they appeared to be actively modifying the concrete itself, slowly altering its chemical composition in ways that created more favorable conditions for their survival. Dr. Walsh was amazed by the implications of this finding. Sarah, these organisms aren't just living in concrete, they're farming it. They're cultivating their environment to support their own growth. This suggests a level of environmental manipulation that we've never seen in microorganisms. As their research progressed, Sarah and Dr. Walsh began to understand that they had stumbled upon what might be humanity's first contact with truly alien life. Not alien in the sense of coming from another planet, but alien in the sense of representing a completely different approach to existence, that had evolved alongside familiar terrestrial life without being recognized. The concrete organisms seemed to represent a parallel evolutionary track that had developed in response to human civilization. As humans created more artificial environments, these organisms had evolved to thrive in the boundary zones between natural and artificial worlds. They were aliens that Earth itself had created in response to human activity. This realization led Sarah and Dr. Departure Walsh to an even more startling hypothesis. If these organisms could evolve to exploit artificial environments on Earth, similar organisms might have evolved to exploit artificial environments on other planets. The search for extraterrestrial life had been focused on finding organisms that could survive in naturally extreme conditions. But perhaps the most likely place to find alien life was in the artificial environments created by alien civilizations. Sarah's original theory had been vindicated in the most unexpected way. She had been right that scientists were looking in the wrong places for extraordinary life, that the truth was even stranger than she had imagined. The extraordinary life they were missing wasn't hiding in ordinary natural environments. It was hiding in artificial environments that were so common that they had become invisible. Sarah and Dr. Walsh prepared to expand their research and begin the process of documenting their discovery for the scientific community. They knew they were about to challenge fundamental assumptions about life, evolution, and humanity's place in the natural world. They had found aliens, but the aliens had been living among humans all along, thriving in the concrete jungle that civilization had built on top of the natural world. The most shocking part was realizing how long these organisms had probably existed without being discovered. Every sidewalk, every foundation, every concrete structure built by human civilization had potentially been harboring this hidden world of life. Scientists had been searching the universe for signs of intelligence while walking over intelligent life forms that were literally beneath their feet. Sarah reflected on the irony of her discovery. She had started graduate school hoping to study extremophiles and search for life in hostile environments. Instead, she had discovered that the most extreme life forms weren't in boiling hot springs or deep ocean trenches, they were in the artificial environments that humans encountered every single day. The next phase of their research would be even more challenging than the discovery itself. Sarah and Dr. Walsh would have to find a way to convince the scientific community that everything they thought they knew about life on Earth was incomplete. They would have to present evidence that would seem impossible to accept, while defending their methods against skeptics who would be motivated to find flaws in research that challenged the foundation of their entire field. But Sarah had learned to embrace the impossible. She had spent her entire career looking where no one else was looking, and now she had found something that would force everyone else to look where they had never thought to search. The concrete beneath their feet wasn't just a foundation for human civilization. It was home to a form of life that represented the future of biology, and possibly the key to understanding life throughout the universe. The decision to go public with their discovery consumed Sarah Chen and Dr. Pak God, Jennifer Walsh, for months. They had spent over a year secretly documenting what they believed to be the most significant biological discovery of the modern era, but they knew that revealing their findings would subject them to the most intense scientific scrutiny imaginable. The concrete-dwelling organisms they had discovered challenged so many fundamental assumptions about life that the scientific community's first instinct would be to prove them wrong. Sarah and Dr. begin. Walsh spent countless hours preparing for the inevitable attacks on their research. They anticipated every possible criticism, conducted additional experiments to address potential objections, and meticulously documented their methodology to withstand the most rigorous peer review process. They knew they would get only one chance to present their case before the scientific community dismissed them as delusional researchers chasing fantasies. The first step was publishing their preliminary findings in a peer-reviewed journal. After much deliberation, they chose to submit their paper to Nature Microbiology, one of the most prestigious journals in their field. They titled their paper, "Discovery of Novel Microorganisms in Urban Concrete Environments, Evidence for a Previously Unknown Branch of Terrestrial Life." The peer review process was brutal. The journal's editors assigned the paper to 5 different reviewers, an unusually high number that reflected the extraordinary nature of the claims being made. 3 of the reviewers recommended immediate rejection, arguing that the findings were either the result of contamination or methodological errors. They couldn't believe that established microbiologists had somehow overlooked an entire category of life that supposedly existed everywhere in urban environments. Dr. Marcus Fleming, one of the world's leading experts on environmental microbiology, wrote a particularly scathing review. He stated, "The authors claim to have discovered organisms that violate basic principles of microbiology in locations that have been thoroughly studied for decades. The more likely explanation is that they have misidentified common contaminants or made fundamental errors in their experimental design. I recommend rejection without revision." However, 2 of the reviewers were more cautious in their criticism. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Barcelona wrote, "While the claims made in this paper are extraordinary and difficult to accept, the methodology appears sound and the data is compelling. The authors have clearly put considerable effort into ruling out obvious explanations for their findings. I recommend major revisions with additional experiments to further validate these remarkable results." The editor of Nature Microbiology was faced with an unprecedented decision. The paper presented evidence for a discovery that would revolutionize microbiology if it were true, but the claims were so radical that accepting them would require overthrowing decades of established scientific understanding. After extensive consultation with the journal's editorial board, they decided to give Sarah and Dr. Barkas publish Walsh a chance to address the reviewers' concerns through major revisions. Sarah and Dr. Walsh spent 6 months conducting additional experiments requested by the reviewers. They collaborated with researchers at other institutions to independently verify their findings. They used different analytical techniques to rule out contamination. They collected samples from urban environments around the world to demonstrate that the organisms were globally distributed rather than limited to the San Francisco Bay Area. Each new experiment confirmed their original findings while providing additional evidence for the extraordinary nature of the concrete-dwelling organisms. The organisms showed remarkable adaptability, thriving in concrete environments with different chemical compositions and environmental conditions. They appeared to form complex networks that spanned entire city blocks, suggesting a level of organization that had never been observed in microorganisms. Perhaps most remarkably, the organisms seemed to actively participate in urban ecosystem functions. They appeared to process pollutants, regulate moisture levels in concrete structures, and even influence the weathering patterns of buildings and infrastructure. Sarah and Dr. Walsh realized they had discovered not just new life forms, but an entirely hidden ecosystem that was intimately connected to human urban environments. When they resubmitted their revised paper, the peer review process was even more contentious than before. The additional evidence made it harder for critics to dismiss the findings as experimental errors, but it also made the implications even more difficult for the scientific community to accept. The paper was sent to additional reviewers, including some of the world's most prominent microbiologists. Dr. Robert Hutchinson, Sarah's former graduate advisor, was among the new reviewers. His response was a mixture of professional pride and scientific skepticism. He wrote, "Having worked with Sarah Chen for several years, I can attest to her exceptional technical skills and rigorous approach to research. However, the claims made in this paper are so extraordinary that they require extraordinary evidence. While the authors have addressed many potential methodological concerns, the fundamental question remains: how could the entire scientific community have overlooked these organisms for so long?" This question haunted Sarah as she awaited the journal's final decision. She had spent years wondering the same thing herself. How could billions of people walk over these life forms every day without anyone noticing them? How could decades of urban environmental research have missed an entire ecosystem that existed in plain sight? The answer, Sarah realized, lay in the nature of scientific observation itself. Scientists only find what they're looking for, and no one had been looking for complex life forms in concrete, because everyone assumed that concrete was too hostile an environment to support anything interesting. The organisms had been invisible not because they were hidden, but because they existed outside the framework of what science expected to find. While waiting for the journal's decision, Sarah and Dr. Walsh began preparing for the next phase of their research. If their paper were accepted, it would immediately become one of the most controversial scientific publications of the decade. They would need to be ready for intense media attention, skeptical colleagues, and demands for additional proof from researchers around the world. They also began reaching out quietly to other scientists who might be interested in collaborating on follow-up research. Dr. Board, Maria Santos from the Brazilian Institute of Environmental Research agreed to search for similar organisms in the concrete structures of Sao Paulo. Dr. Zhang Wei from Beijing University began analyzing samples from Chinese cities. Amara Okafor from the University of Lagos started investigating concrete-dwelling organisms in Nigerian urban environments. The preliminary results from these international collaborations were stunning. The concrete-dwelling organisms appeared to be a global phenomenon, present in urban environments on every continent. Each location showed local variations in the organism's characteristics, suggesting that they had evolved to adapt to different environmental conditions while maintaining their fundamental biological properties. 18 months after their initial submission, Sarah and Dr. Walsh received the news they had been hoping for. Nature Microbiology had accepted their paper for publication. The editor's letter acknowledged the controversial nature of their findings, but stated that the evidence was too compelling to ignore. This paper presents findings that challenge fundamental assumptions about microbial life, the editor wrote. While the claims are extraordinary, the authors have provided extraordinary evidence to support them. The publication of this work will undoubtedly generate significant debate within the scientific community, but that debate is necessary for the advancement of our understanding of life on Earth. The publication date was set for 3 months in the future, giving Sarah and Dr. Walsh time to prepare for the response they knew would follow. They drafted press releases, prepared presentations for scientific conferences, and developed protocols for sharing their research methods with other laboratories that would inevitably want to replicate their findings. As the publication date approached, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started graduate school believing that the most interesting discoveries in microbiology would come from studying extreme environments in remote locations. Instead, she had found the most extraordinary life forms in the most ordinary locations imaginable. The concrete-dwelling organisms represented more than just a new branch of life. They represented a fundamental shift in how science approached the search for the unknown. Sarah's discovery proved that the most important scientific breakthroughs could come from questioning basic assumptions about what was possible and looking in places that everyone else had dismissed as uninteresting. But Sarah also knew that publishing the paper was just the beginning of an even greater challenge. The scientific community's response to their discovery would determine whether this research would revolutionize biology or be dismissed as an elaborate mistake. Sarah had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare her for the storm of controversy that was about to engulf her life. The day before publication, Sarah stood outside the Stanford Library where she had collected the sample that started everything. Students walked up and down the concrete steps, completely unaware that they were treading on what might be the most significant biological discovery of their lifetime. In a few hours, the entire world would learn about the hidden ecosystem that existed beneath their feet. Sarah thought about the 12-year-old girl who had investigated fish deaths in an Oregon river, because the official explanation didn't make sense to her. That girl had grown up to challenge the biggest assumptions in science and discover aliens hiding in plain sight on a university campus. As she watched students hurry past on their way to study for exams and attend lectures, Sarah realized that tomorrow everything would be different. The scientific community would never again be able to assume that they understood all the forms of life that existed on Earth. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence would expand to include artificial environments that might harbor life forms too strange for traditional detection methods. Most importantly, scientists would finally understand that the most extraordinary discoveries often come from having the courage to look in the most ordinary places, where everyone else has already decided there's nothing left to find. Sarah had proven that impossible was often just another word for no one has looked there yet. The next morning, the world would wake up to learn that aliens had been living among humans all along, thriving in the concrete foundations of civilization itself. And Sarah Chen, the daughter of restaurant owners who had been told that her scientific dreams were impractical, would be the one to introduce humanity to its newest neighbors. The morning Nature Microbiology published Sarah Chen's paper. The world woke up to headlines that seemed ripped from science fiction. Scientists discover alien life forms living in city sidewalks, hidden ecosystem found beneath our feet, and the aliens were here all along. Life forms discovered in urban concrete. Sarah's phone began ringing at 4:30 a.m. Pacific time, as news outlets from around the globe scrambled to interview the woman who had found extraterrestrial life in one of the most mundane locations on Earth. Within hours of publication, Sarah found herself at the center of a media frenzy that transformed her from an unknown graduate student into the most famous scientist in the world. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, her collaborator, met Sarah at Stanford's press office, where they had prepared for this moment with media training and carefully crafted talking points. But nothing could have prepared them for the intensity of global interest in their discovery. The university's phone system was overwhelmed by interview requests from journalists, documentary filmmakers, and book publishers from 6 different continents. The press conference held at Stanford that afternoon was unprecedented in the university's history. More than 200 journalists packed into the auditorium, with additional reporters joining via video link from news bureaus around the world. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of cameras and microphones, knowing that her next words would be transmitted to billions of people within minutes. 3 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I collected a sample from the concrete steps outside this university's library. I was looking for signs of life that science might have overlooked in ordinary environments. What I found changed everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. Sarah explained her discovery in terms that both scientists and the general public could understand. She described how the concrete-dwelling organisms represented an entirely new form of life that had evolved alongside human civilization, thriving in the artificial environments that people encountered every day. She emphasized that these weren't just new species, but fundamentally different approaches to life that operated according to biological principles that science was only beginning to understand. The questions from reporters reflected the profound implications of Sarah's discovery. How long had these organisms existed? Were they dangerous to humans? Could similar life forms exist on other planets? Were there other undiscovered ecosystems hiding in plain sight? Sarah answered each question carefully, emphasizing both the excitement and the uncertainty that surrounded her findings. We're still learning about these organisms, she explained. What we know is that they appear to be beneficial rather than harmful to human environments. They seem to help maintain and even improve the infrastructure they inhabit. But we have much more to discover about their biology, their origins, and their ecological role. Doctor! Maria Santos, calling in from Sao Paulo, provided confirmation that the organisms had been found in Brazilian cities. Dr. Zhang Wei reported similar findings from Beijing. Within hours of publication, research teams from around the world were confirming that Sarah's discovery represented a global phenomenon that had been hiding under humanity's nose for potentially decades or even centuries. The scientific community's response was as dramatic as the media coverage. While some researchers embraced the discovery as the beginning of a new era in biology, others remained skeptical and demanded additional verification. Dr. Robert Hutchinson, Sarah's former advisor, found himself in the awkward position of defending his former students' work while privately struggling to accept findings that challenged everything he had taught for 30 years. Sarah Chen has always been an exceptional researcher, Dr. Hutchinson told Science magazine. Her methods are rigorous, and her findings appear to be reproducible. While these results challenge conventional wisdom, science must be willing to revise its understanding when presented with compelling evidence. However, not all of Sarah's colleagues were supportive. Dr. Marcus Fleming, the microbiologist who had initially recommended rejecting her paper, went on television to argue that the discovery was being overblown by media hype. While Dr. Chen may have found some unusual microorganisms, Dr. Fleming stated, calling them alien life forms is sensationalistic. These are likely just previously unknown variations of terrestrial bacteria that have adapted to artificial environments. The scientific community should be cautious about accepting extraordinary claims without extraordinary proof. This skepticism motivated researchers around the world to attempt their own replications of Sarah's work. Laboratories in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia began collecting samples from urban concrete environments and applying Sarah's detection methods. The results were consistent. Everywhere researchers looked, they found evidence of the same type of concrete-dwelling organisms that Sarah had discovered. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Barcelona organized an international consortium of researchers to coordinate replication efforts and share findings. Within 6 months of Sarah's initial publication, more than 50 research institutions had confirmed the existence of concrete-dwelling organisms in their local urban environments. The consortium's collaborative research revealed even more extraordinary properties of these organisms. They appeared to form vast networks that spanned entire cities, communicating through chemical signals and coordinating their activities across enormous distances. They seemed to monitor and respond to changes in urban infrastructure, often concentrating their activity around aging or damaged concrete structures that needed the most maintenance. Perhaps most remarkably, the organisms appeared to learn from their environment and adapt their behavior based on human activity patterns. In busy pedestrian areas, they modified their metabolic cycles to avoid interference from foot traffic. Near construction sites, they accelerated their infrastructure maintenance activities. They seemed to have developed a form of symbiotic relationship with human civilization that no one had recognized. The discovery's implications extended far beyond biology into fields ranging from urban planning to astrobiology. Engineers began studying the organism's effects on concrete durability and considering how they might be harnessed to create self-maintaining infrastructure. Environmental scientists investigated their role in urban ecosystem functions and pollution processing. Astrobiologists reconsidered their approaches to searching for extraterrestrial life, wondering if alien civilizations might harbor similar artificial environment organisms. NASA announced a new research program to investigate whether similar life forms might exist in the artificial environments created by potential alien civilizations. The agency redirected funding from traditional SETI programs toward developing detection methods for artificial environment organisms that might exist on planets with technological civilizations. The philosophical implications of Sarah's discovery were equally profound. Humanity had spent centuries wondering whether they were alone in the universe, while sharing their planet with life forms that were as alien as anything found in science fiction. These organisms represented a form of intelligence that operated according to completely different principles from human cognition, yet they had been silently collaborating with human civilization for potentially generations. Religious leaders struggled to incorporate the discovery into existing theological frameworks. Some saw the organisms as evidence of divine creativity that exceeded human understanding. Others interpreted them as proof that life was more abundant and diverse than humans had ever imagined, supporting beliefs about the interconnectedness of all existence. Urban planners began consulting with biologists to understand how concrete-dwelling organisms affected city infrastructure and whether their activities could be incorporated into sustainable development strategies. Architects started designing buildings that would work in harmony with these hidden ecosystems, rather than unknowingly disrupting them. The discovery also sparked new debates about humanity's relationship with technology and artificial environments. Environmental activists argued that the organisms proved that nature and technology weren't necessarily opposing forces, but could evolve together in mutually beneficial ways. Technology advocates suggested that the organisms demonstrated the potential for creating truly sustainable artificial environments that enhanced rather than degraded natural systems. For Sarah personally, the discovery's impact was overwhelming. She found herself invited to speak at conferences around the world, consulted by governments developing new environmental policies, and offered research positions at prestigious institutions. Publishers competed to secure rights to her autobiography, and Hollywood studios began developing films based on her story. But Sarah remained focused on the scientific work that had driven her from the beginning. She established the Institute for Artificial Environment Biology at Stanford, dedicated to studying the organisms she had discovered and searching for other life forms that might be hiding in unexpected locations. The institute attracted researchers from around the world who shared Sarah's willingness to look beyond conventional assumptions about where life could exist. Dr. Walsh became the institute's co-director, continuing the collaboration that had started with their secret late-night research sessions. Together they developed new detection methods and theoretical frameworks for understanding life forms that existed at the intersection of natural and artificial environments. 5 years after publication of her groundbreaking paper, Sarah stood once again on the concrete steps outside Stanford's library where her discovery had begun. The steps looked exactly the same as they had when she was a nervous graduate student collecting samples in secret, but everything else had changed. The scientific community now recognized that Earth harbored multiple forms of life that operated according to principles beyond traditional biology. Urban planners designed cities in partnership with biological consultants who understood artificial environment ecosystems. Children learned in school about the hidden life forms that maintained the concrete structures they walked on every day. Most importantly, science had embraced the principle that had driven Sarah's entire career. The most extraordinary discoveries often come from looking in the most ordinary places, with fresh eyes and the courage to question fundamental assumptions. Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a small-town restaurant owner's daughter to the discoverer of alien life on Earth. She had learned that impossible was often just another word for no one has looked there yet, and that the biggest breakthroughs in human knowledge came from having the courage to search where everyone else had already decided there was nothing to find. As students hurried past her on the library steps, Sarah smiled at the knowledge that they were walking on a living ecosystem that was as alien and extraordinary as anything in the universe, yet as familiar and everyday as the concrete beneath their feet. The impossible had become possible, not through looking to the stars, but through looking down at the ground where no one else had thought to search. Sarah's discovery had proven that aliens weren't coming from distant galaxies to visit humanity. They had been here all along, building a civilization alongside human civilization, waiting patiently for someone with the vision to recognize that the extraordinary often hides in the most ordinary places. The universe was far stranger and more wonderful than anyone had imagined, and it was all hiding in plain sight beneath the concrete foundations of everyday life.